Alright guys, welcome back. Today we're going to do a transmission temperature gauge install on the 91 K5 Blazer. So this is what I'm using. I'll kind of walk it in here. I pick up the same electronic temperature gauge every time. This is from O'Reilly's. It just goes from 100 to 280. It's a pretty good range if you're dealing with transmission or engine temperature. Really, you're not, I mean, if you're above 280, you're pretty much overheating no matter what on any engine. Most engines overheat at around 230, well, 265 to 250, somewhere in there. So the kit itself is going to come with the actual, the gauge. It's going to come with the probes, the male connectors on the back, and a couple adapters for the temperature sensor probe, which is this guy. And then it comes with the female attachments and the eyelet and everything to run all the wires. Or if you're going to hook it up to a transmission line, that's what I use this for. This is just 3 different pieces. I got it from, I've gotten it from Ace Hardware before. Yeah, I actually got it from Ace Hardware today as well. So both these ends screw off. It's just a 3/8 T fitting, brass T fitting. And then this is 3/8 down to, I want to say 1/8 hose barb, and they're just, I'm gonna wrap pretty much on every male part with the threads. I'm gonna wrap Teflon tape around it and then put this all together. This is the adapter that came with the temperature sender unit that I bought from O'Reilly's. That's gonna go in up top here, and then you're gonna cut a hole in your transmission line, and then I'll show you how to, and then you basically just reconnect it right over here with some hose clamps on the hose, on the hose barbs, and then the temperature sender unit goes right in the top here, threads in, tighten it all down. Normally this unit here is going to ground through the sender, so normally you'd thread it into the block and then it would just ground through the car. Since you're gonna splice this into the transmission cooler line, that's a rubber line. This is no longer gonna have anywhere to ground. That's how I do it, but basically I take an eyelet and run it in between right here and right here. And then when I go ahead and tighten this down, it's gonna pinch that, and then I'll run that to a ground location somewhere on the firewall of the truck. Now I'm gonna take you guys through how I wire this up every time. Should be pretty straightforward. We'll have to take apart the dash, and I'll show you which line to hook it up on the transmission right now. Alright, so this is pretty much a standard, you know, 80s Chevy dash. You've got battery, oil pressure, temperature, engine temperature, speedometer, and a gas gauge right over there. So this is usually a blank, and I'm going to shoot to put the transmission temperature gauge right in here because it should fit. It's the right size. Right now, first thing, take off the negative terminal to the battery so you don't electrocute yourself. And then just start taking apart the dash. It's pretty straightforward. There's going to be a bunch of screws. There's going to be a couple down here underneath the steering column, a couple more here. There's a whole bunch of them right around here. So, pro tip, when you're trying to take off the dash, it gets kind of hung up on the steering column. To go ahead and drop the steering column, it's just 2 15 bolts on the side of the steering column. Wiggle the dash out. A lot easier. Alright, I'm actually pulling out the cluster right now. It's held on by a bunch of 7 bolts. Ooh. All the way around just like this. Keep in mind, you will have to take out the ones around this little dash transmission indicator, and that'll kind of fall and dangle down. But you're gonna have to take it out as well. Keep in mind, guys, when you're gonna take out the gauge cluster, you have to actually remove this whole top piece of the dash, and there's one little bolt hidden over here. It's a Phillips head. You gotta back that out in order to take off this dash cap topper, whatever. And there is not one on the driver's side, but there is one on the passenger side. So make sure you take that off so that you can take this thing off without bending, breaking, or snapping it. Leave that over here. And then just like that, the rest of this is gonna slide off. Okay, and then another thing to keep in mind when you're taking this dash off, there is an air conditioning duct that goes and hooks up to the back side of this vent that actually runs air. And if you just try to pull it off, you'll get hung up on it and it won't want to come off. So you gotta reach back here and slide it off. Stuck it on there pretty good. There you go. The last time I was in there. What it is this piece. It's just an air duct vent. It's gonna run from right over there, right down in there. You can see where it attaches onto, and then it's gonna bend around and attach right onto this. So you can just kind of pull it apart. That's what I've done. And then make sure you line it back up when you're reassembling everything. For now, we'll let it hang out. All right, right now, this is the back of the dash. And all I've done is started taking out some of the electrical connections. Go ahead and press them in. On that side. So now let's get this over to the bench and we will figure out how we're gonna mount our new temp gauge for the transmission. All right, I'm taking off the little dust cover. And then this is the spot we're gonna use. The way this gauge mounts up is it basically it just screws with this piece back on here, and it's gonna pinch whatever material is in between. All right, so we're done. I have the gauge in the cluster, and I think it came out looking pretty good. I'll show you guys how I did it. But we had to hack it up quite a bit, so I'll let that be your guys' call. So this is what it looks like. This is the plastic covers on top of it. So if we go ahead and remove that, the dust shield, and then we'll go ahead and remove this little, again, trim piece. And then here's the gauge for the transmission that we mounted in here. If you saw before, it was kind of like the plastic continued here and then did about a 90-degree bend there. And same with this. So there was a big, there's a whole bunch of plastic pieces that I pretty much I cut out with one of these guys, a wire snip, and then I also soldered it out. That helped. And then if you look at the back side, what we did, we just bent the circuit board back. You can see the holes that I cut out for the soldering so I can mount up the wiring for the gauge. And then here's the light little hole I had to cut out right there, and we'll just wire in the lights to the positive and the ground for the gauge so that it's always on. That's your choice, of course. That's just what I chose to do. All right, now we're gonna wire up the power and everything for our transmission temperature. So here's the dash, and we've got it wired up right now for the power and the ground. We don't have the sender hooked up yet, but the ground on the Chevys, there's a bunch of grounds you can use right over here. They've got a bunch of male connectors. You just attach a female onto the end of a wire and it presses right on there. This is the sender wire hanging out. I haven't hooked it up yet. The ground and the power are hooked up at the back of the gauge. There goes my flashlight. And we'll take a quick look underneath the dash to show you what I've used to hook up the power. You see right up there, now you're not going to be able to see where it says ignition, so it's right here. See this wire? Right next to it is where I've hooked in our power source. It just says ignition underneath it. There's two open terminals. There's no fuse in it. So right at the top of the screen, you should be able to see two wires. There's an ignition slot right there. One is my ignition and the other one is the power source that I've hooked up. So now, when I turn on, right now, there's no power on the gauge. It's got no power going to it. But as soon as I put the key in, There we go. So now it won't drain the battery whenever the car is off, but we've got power going to that gauge. So now it's off. Now we're gonna plumb in the sender to the transmission cooler line, and we'll hook up that wire, and then we'll pretty much just put everything back together. So this is the T-fitting we made with the hose barbs. I'll put the link in the description. Pretty much everything I got from Ace Hardware, it was about $11, I think, give or take. Now this sensor is electronic, so normally this is just plugged right into the block and it grounds through the block of the engine. Since we're going to be plumbing it into a transmission cooler line, there is no metal. So what I've done before and in the past is I'll take a ground, I'll make my own ground wire, and then I'll just put it right in between the sensor and the adapter. I'm gonna go ahead and thread this in right now. And then I'm gonna keep tightening this up all the way until I get it pinched down. You wanna tighten everything. I put this in a vise and cranked this around with an adjustable wrench to tighten everything up as much as possible. And I'm gonna do the same with this top probe here, because we don't want it to leak at all. It's a pain in the ass to get to it. You're gonna have to take it all the way off if you need to fix any leaks later. So, and then once we do that, we're gonna actually ground this. There's tons of grounds all over the inside of the engine bay. We're gonna be plumbing it into this line right here. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but basically it's gonna go in here and I'm gonna run the ground right up here. This way. Then all we have to do is run the sensor wire up top here, and then plug that into the back of the gauge on our dash and patch everything else up and we'll be set. So let's go ahead and tighten this down. So let's go ahead and cut our transmission cooler line. Now what you're looking at is the return and the send line for the transmission. On the 700R4, there's going to be two transmission lines that run from the side of the transmission body and come up here to get cooled. The one that is on the bottom, closer to the ground, would be the send line for the hot fluid. It's going to come up here, go through the cooling, and then go back via the other line, the return line, which is on top of the transmission body. So I followed it earlier. The send line, which has the hot fluid, would be this metal line right here. And it's going to come all the way up. It's metal the entire way. It goes up here, goes into the radiator, goes through the radiator, comes out down here, and has this tube spliced into it, which runs over here, goes to the top of a transmission cooler. Gravity takes it down through the transmission cooler, then it comes back via this line, comes out of the transmission cooler, wraps around here, and then goes back into the return line. So normally there wouldn't have been a transmission cooler on this truck, it looks like. This is the original OEM hard line that goes into the radiator, and then right down here what you can see would be this hard line. This originally would have threaded right into the radiator just like this one has, and that would have been all the cooling that there was. Now these transmissions, they tend to blow up pretty easily because people are trying to do a lot of snow plowing or towing with them and they overheat. Someone was smart on this truck and they've just pulled out that return line and then they plumbed in a transmission cooler already. So what would have happened before is you would have seen the fluid just run through the radiator and go straight back to the transmission. Should have done this a couple days ago. I'm gonna get something better to tighten that down. So that's pretty much it. That's how we're gonna plumb it in. And then like I said, I'm gonna ground this out right up here. And then I'll run, this is the sender wire that we still have to hook up to the gauge, but that's just gonna go ahead and sit right on the top of here. There's two bolts that sandwich it down with a lock nut or a lock washer. I'm gonna tighten down these hose barbs a little bit more, and that's pretty much it. So here's the temperature gauge for the transmission. It'd work for an engine temperature either way, both will work. Here's the light up top. This is the power for the light and the ground for the light. I always just splice them into the power for the gauge and the ground for the gauge, just because I'm lazy, don't want to run extra wire. I'd rather just have the light on the entire time. I'll change the bulb if it ever burns out. So that's what I do. And then the sender wire for the gauge is going to be down here at the bottom, always, at least for these temperature gauge units that I buy. So this is the power. This is going right down to that ignition slot that I showed. This is the ground, and it's running this wire. They're all blue, and it runs right over here. If you can see on the left side of the dash, there's a bunch of grounds. Here's pretty much the only electrical connection you're gonna have for your dash. Blue and green, solid, go up top. It pops right back in. And then we had 2 lights that I pulled out. So now all right, so it wasn't too bad. Dash is back together. Steering column back in. As usual, I'm left with a bunch of tools scattered all over the place that I gotta pick up later, but I'll save that for another day. I think that's pretty much it. If you guys have any questions, just leave comments in the comment section below. Like, share, subscribe. Yeah.